They told me I was swimming too well and banned me from the community pool. What started as an absurd punishment quickly revealed favoritism, intimidation, and abuse of power within the HOA. Watch how one homeowner exposed the injustice, rallied the community, and turned ridiculous rules into a victory for fairness. The summer had arrived early that year, bringing with it thick, humid air and a restless energy that swept through the quiet community of Clearwater Ridge. Families began gathering at the community pool, children splashing, parents lounging beneath umbrellas, and the HOA board becoming more visible than ever, inspecting, monitoring, recording, and ensuring that every member followed their ever-growing list of rules. To most residents, the pool was a seasonal relief. But for Ryan, it was one of the few places where he could clear his mind, push away stress, and focus on something that felt simple: swimming. He wasn't a professional swimmer, just a naturally strong one who had grown up near water. Swimming was his therapy, his escape, his breathing space after long workdays. He visited the pool 3 to 4 times a week, always at quiet hours, never disturbing anyone. His movements were calm, smooth, and borderline meditative. For the first few weeks of summer, everything remained uneventful. The pool staff barely noticed him beyond a polite nod, and the other residents simply saw a man enjoying his time in the water. But as June deepened into full summer, subtle changes began appearing around the pool. The HOA installed new security cameras pointing down at the water, additional rule boards near the entrance, and a sign-in sheet that suddenly required full names, home addresses, and visitation times. Ryan thought nothing of it at first, just another layer of control from an HOA known for micromanagement. But he couldn't ignore the shift in atmosphere. The sound of laughter seemed slightly more guarded. The presence of on-duty monitor volunteers grew heavier, and the board president, Denise, began making frequent appearances. Denise was infamous in Clearwater Ridge. Strict, cold, and overly invested in the HOA's authority, she behaved as though the neighborhood was her personal kingdom. For years, she had enforced rules that made no sense: grass height inspections, driveway color restrictions, fines for leaving trash bins visible for more than 6 minutes. Residents tried to avoid conflict with her, and Ryan did too. He lived quietly, stayed responsible, and kept his distance. But Denise had a habit of paying attention to those who didn't bend immediately to her silent expectations. One Thursday morning, the pool was calm and nearly empty as Ryan slid into the water. The sun cast warm reflections across the surface, and the faint smell of chlorine blended with the breeze. His strokes cut smoothly through the water, the repetitive motion grounding him. For nearly 20 minutes, the world felt still, peaceful. He didn't notice Denise's arrival, not at first. She stood near the shallow end with a clipboard, watching him with a narrowed expression. Her eyes followed every lap, every turn, every push through the water. It wasn't curiosity, it was scrutiny, the kind that made the air feel heavier. Eventually, she approached one of the volunteer monitors, whispering something while occasionally pointing toward Ryan. He continued swimming, unaware of what was brewing at the poolside. To him, nothing unusual was happening. But to Denise, something was deeply wrong, or so she wanted to believe. As minutes passed, her frustration seemed to grow. Her foot tapped impatiently, her arms crossed tightly, and her attention remained locked on him as though he were committing a serious offense by simply swimming well. When Ryan finally took a break and pulled himself out of the water, he noticed several board members standing together at the end of the pool. Their faces were strange expressions, a mix of annoyance, discomfort, and forced authority. He sensed tension, but he assumed they were conducting some kind of routine inspection. He grabbed his towel, sat at the edge of a chair, and tried to ignore the lingering gaze of the HOA board. But then he noticed other residents subtly looking toward him as well. A few whispered to each other, puzzled, unsure of what was happening. The atmosphere shifted even more. Something unspoken flowed through the space, weaving quietly between each person present. By his 4th visit that week, the surveillance increased. Denise stationed herself near the pool gate, her eyes following Ryan from the moment he entered until the moment he left. A new rule sign appeared: No speed swimming. No disturbing lap activity. All swimmers must consider the comfort of others. It was vague, ridiculously vague, and everyone knew it. Still, Ryan ignored it because it clearly wasn't meant for anyone in particular. Or so he thought. The breaking point arrived on a Saturday morning. The pool was busier than usual, children playing, adults chatting, and sunlight glimmering off the blue water. Ryan began his laps, steady, controlled, rhythmic. A peaceful moment that lasted less than 10 minutes before Denise marched toward him with a purposeful stride. He didn't notice until the volunteer monitor loudly blew a whistle. An unnecessary, theatrical gesture that echoed across the pool deck. Conversation stopped. Splashes quieted. Eyes turned. Everything froze for a moment. Residents looked around, confused, expecting perhaps a safety issue or a rule violation. But the reality was so absurd, so unexpected, it left the entire area in stunned silence. The HOA had decided that Ryan was swimming too well. Within minutes of leaving the water, he found himself surrounded by board members who handed him a printed notice. No warning. No explanation. No conversation. Just a declaration. You are banned from the community pool effective immediately for engaging in competitive, disruptive, and attention-seeking swimming that makes other residents uncomfortable. The absurdity of the claim spread through whispers around the pool. Residents exchanged baffled looks. Even the children seemed confused. Who gets banned for swimming too well? But Denise looked satisfied. It was personal, targeted, and the way she guarded the pool gate afterward made it clear. This wasn't just about swimming. It was about control, and someone had just stepped into her crosshairs without realizing it. The ban was only the beginning. A deeper agenda was unfolding, one that would soon reveal favoritism, hidden deals, and the real reason Denise wanted Ryan gone from the pool. A reason that had nothing to do with swimming. The following week, Ryan found himself standing outside the pool gates, staring at the bright blue water that had suddenly become forbidden territory. The sun reflected off the surface, playful children splashing around, parents laughing, and the gentle hum of summer filling the air. Yet for him, it was now untouchable. The sense of injustice was overwhelming. He had always followed the rules, never drawn attention, and yet here he was, publicly labeled a troublemaker for something as innocuous as swimming skillfully. Word traveled quickly through Clearwater Ridge. Whispers and conversations began at community mailboxes, over coffee at local cafes, and on social media groups exclusive to residents. The HOA's absurd decision became the topic of debate. Some laughed, thinking it was a harmless misunderstanding. Others were more concerned, recognizing the blatant abuse of power. Residents who once stayed silent about the HOA's overreach now had a concrete example of arbitrary, petty, and targeted enforcement. The notice, plastered with official logos and signatures, read like an official document, yet it was built on subjective, ridiculous claims. Ryan was not only banned, he was humiliated. He decided to gather evidence. Using his phone, he began recording the pool during times when no one was around. He documented how he swam. Slow, methodical, quiet. Nothing disruptive. Nothing competitive. His movements were steady, meditative, and unobtrusive. Every turn, every stroke, every breath was captured in meticulous detail. It wasn't long before he realized the magnitude of what he was dealing with. The HOA's ban wasn't grounded in community comfort, safety, or fairness. It was personal. The board's motives were layered with envy, favoritism, and perhaps hidden vendettas that only they understood. And Ryan was starting to see the pattern. He spoke with neighbors cautiously. Many expressed sympathy but were afraid to openly oppose the HOA. The climate of fear and intimidation had silenced most residents for years. Yet, a few brave individuals quietly confided that they had noticed Denise's subtle biases. She favored some families, particularly those aligned with her personal interests, while she scrutinized others relentlessly. This pattern of selective enforcement had remained unnoticed because no one had dared challenge it, until Ryan's swimming ability became the unlikely trigger for exposure. the ban had other, subtler effects. Ryan's daily routine was disrupted. His physical therapy, his stress relief, and even his social life were suddenly affected. Friends who joined him for casual swims could no longer accompany him without risking fines themselves. The pool, once a neutral space, had become a symbol of control. It was an arena where the HOA wielded arbitrary power, proving that they could disrupt even the simplest joys of everyday life with little accountability. Ryan knew that standing up would be challenging, but ignoring it would embolden Denise and the board to escalate further. Determined to confront the injustice, he submitted a formal appeal to the HOA. He outlined, in clear, professional terms, that his swimming was peaceful, non-disruptive, and entirely appropriate. He included timestamps, videos, and statements from neighbors who had witnessed his behavior. Days passed with no response. The HOA's silence was deafening, and rumors swirled that Denise was actively plotting the next move. It became clear that the board saw Ryan not as a resident to be served, but as a threat to their image of absolute control. Meanwhile, subtle intimidation continued. Notices appeared at the pool gate reiterating the ban. Security monitors watched the entrance more vigilantly, asking residents if they had seen Ryan anywhere near the pool. Conversations behind closed doors hinted at plans to expand restrictions, targeting him beyond the pool, possibly the gym, community events, or shared outdoor spaces. The creeping sense of power abuse became evident. The HOA was using rules as weapons, not guidance. And Ryan realized this wasn't just about swimming. It was about proving that no resident could assert independence without scrutiny. Determined to document everything, Ryan invested in discreet security cameras around the pool's public areas. Not for spying, but for transparency. He captured board members discussing rules, their gestures revealing personal motives, their whispers hinting at favoritism, and their approval of policies designed to intimidate specific residents. The recordings would become critical later, providing indisputable proof that the so-called rules were applied selectively, targeting him unfairly. It became clear, the HOA's ban was never about comfort, noise, or etiquette. It was about maintaining control over residents who dared to remain independent or competent. Tensions in the neighborhood grew. Some residents, previously indifferent, began questioning the board's decisions. While most remained silent publicly, private discussions revealed disbelief and anger at the blatant absurdity of the ban. Community trust was eroding rapidly. Ryan's persistence in documenting, appealing, and quietly rallying support became a subtle catalyst, exposing cracks in the HOA's authoritarian veneer. Every day, his ban highlighted the HOA's hypocrisy, their arbitrary enforcement, and the thinly veiled vendettas behind their polished public facade. The situation escalated further when a small group of residents began approaching Ryan for guidance. They shared stories of previous petty fines, invasive inspections, and subtle harassment. Ryan realized that his case was not isolated. It was symptomatic of a broader pattern. Each neighbor he spoke to revealed a silent history of manipulation by the HOA. What had started as a personal slight over swimming ability was transforming into a larger movement, an unspoken rebellion against arbitrary authority. Ryan's fight had unknowingly become a beacon, inspiring others to question the board and seek fairness in a system designed to suppress dissent. And as the week drew to a close, Ryan received an unexpected visit. A mid-level board member, appearing cautiously at the edge of the neighborhood park, offered a cryptic warning. He hinted that the HOA had no intention of reversing the ban and suggested that continued resistance could provoke further action, including fines, public notices, or even suspension from other community privileges. The veiled threat made it clear. The HOA intended to escalate, and Ryan's persistence was now a threat to the very authority Denise and her allies wielded. The battle lines were drawn. What had begun as a swimming ban had spiraled into a confrontation with the neighborhood's most controlling figures. Ryan understood that winning would require more than polite appeals. It would require strategy, evidence, patience, and the courage to expose the truth, all while navigating a community where neighbors feared retaliation. The stage was set for confrontation, and Ryan knew that the next moves would determine whether he remained powerless under the HOA's arbitrary rules, or turn the tables entirely. The days after the subtle warning from the mid-level board member felt heavier than ever. Ryan's routine had transformed from simple relaxation at the pool to a meticulous campaign of observation, documentation, and cautious communication. Every movement, every notice, every whispered remark from the HOA had to be noted. What initially seemed like an isolated act of petty cruelty now revealed itself as a systematic exercise in intimidation. The HOA's focus on him was not about public safety or community enjoyment. It was about dominance, control, and demonstrating to all residents that defiance would not be tolerated. Ryan began attending other community events, carefully observing interactions between board members and residents. At first, he blended in, listening quietly to conversations during weekly meetings, social gatherings at the park, and casual neighborhood strolls. Slowly, he began connecting patterns. How Denise selectively praised certain families, how minor infractions by favored residents were ignored, and how trivial matters became escalating punishments for others. Every incident he recorded became part of a growing dossier that painted a vivid picture of favoritism, bias, and abuse of authority. His efforts to gather allies required discretion. Residents who had silently suffered under the HOA's oppressive policies were hesitant to speak out, fearing fines, public embarrassment, or social isolation. Ryan approached them with careful neutrality, framing conversations around fairness and transparency rather than personal vendettas. Gradually, he discovered several residents who were willing to contribute statements, recount personal experiences, and even provide photographic or video evidence of past petty fines, arbitrary rules, and selective enforcement. This informal coalition grew slowly, silently, but its potential was significant. Meanwhile, Ryan continued documenting his own interactions with the pool. He filmed his swimming sessions at various times of the day, showing that his behavior was consistently calm, quiet, and non-disruptive. He even captured moments when children played loudly nearby without attracting attention from the HOA. The evidence was undeniable. The claim that he was swimming too well and disturbing other residents was patently absurd. His collection of timestamps, videos, and observations became an irrefutable record, creating a foundation for confronting the HOA formally and publicly. Tensions with Denise escalated during weekly inspections. She began lingering near the pool entrance, staring at him from afar, making notes, and occasionally speaking quietly to volunteers. Her presence was no longer subtle. It became a psychological tool, a constant reminder that she was watching, judging, and preparing her next move. Ryan realized that her fixation on him was not just personal but performative. She intended to demonstrate to the entire community that anyone who dared to exist outside her approval could face consequences, however ludicrous they might be. The coalition of residents slowly grew bolder. Neighbors who had remained silent for years began speaking about other arbitrary fines, invasive inspections, and unreasonable restrictions. Patterns emerged. Certain families were protected, others punished, and no one outside Denise's circle could question her decisions without facing retaliation. Ryan, once a lone target, now became the central figure in a growing awareness of systemic abuse. The absurdity of the swimming ban became symbolic of the larger struggle for fairness within the neighborhood. The HOA attempted additional intimidation tactics. Notices appeared in mailboxes reminding residents of rules about pool etiquette, consideration for others, and acceptable activity levels. Volunteers stationed near the pool were instructed to report any suspicious behavior, a vague label applied selectively. Social media threads were monitored, and minor complaints were escalated into formal warnings. Ryan realized the strategy was clear. Isolate him, make others wary of supporting him, and maintain the illusion that his ban was justified. The board's obsession was disproportionate, hinting at deeper motives beyond the pool itself. Ryan decided it was time for a more structured approach. He created a secure folder containing all evidence, organized by date, time, and type. Every video clip, photograph, written observation, and neighbor statement was cataloged meticulously. This preparation was not just for confrontation, it was a safeguard against potential retaliation. The HOA's history of arbitrary enforcement meant that any misstep could be weaponized against him. He understood that documentation and precision were his strongest tools in an environment governed by caprice. As he built his case, Ryan also prepared for eventual public exposure. He considered presenting evidence to the neighborhood association, local news outlets, or even legal authorities if necessary. Transparency was essential. He knew that the HOA relied on secrecy, intimidation, and selective enforcement to maintain control. By shining light on their actions, he could challenge the authority they wielded unchecked. This realization instilled both hope and anxiety. The stakes were high, and the board's obsession with maintaining dominance made confrontation inevitable. By the third week of his ban, the pool had become a symbol of struggle for many residents. Conversations in the neighborhood shifted subtly but noticeably. Children playing in the shallow end became a background to whispered discussions among adults. Questions arose. Why was a resident banned for swimming skillfully? How could such a rule exist? The absurdity of the situation highlighted the HOA's overreach, exposing cracks in the carefully maintained facade of authority. Ryan's persistence was becoming contagious, empowering neighbors who had long tolerated small injustices to reconsider their silence. Then, unexpectedly, Ryan discovered an internal email leak from one of the HOA volunteers, a private conversation revealing Denise's personal vendetta. It described how she had perceived Ryan as too competent, drawing attention, and challenging the subtle hierarchy she maintained. This confirmation was staggering. The swimming ban was entirely personal, not about community comfort, safety, or etiquette. It was the ultimate misuse of power, thinly disguised as rule enforcement. With this knowledge, Ryan realized that exposing the ban was only the first step. The larger fight was about accountability, fairness, and ending arbitrary authority. Ryan felt a mixture of determination and apprehension. He was no longer just a swimmer. He was an observer, organizer, and catalyst. The HOA's oppressive tactics had inadvertently united residents and created a path toward exposing systemic favoritism. The swimming ban was the spark, but the fire of awareness and accountability was just beginning to grow. Denise's obsession had unwittingly strengthened Ryan's resolve, setting the stage for the confrontation that would change the dynamics of Clearwater Ridge forever. The tension in Clearwater Ridge was palpable. Residents who had once treated the HOA with passive compliance now whispered about fairness, favoritism, and the bizarre ban imposed on Ryan. The pool, once a place of leisure, had become a symbol of injustice. Ryan's meticulous documentation had grown into an organized body of evidence, including video clips, photographs, and statements from neighbors who had quietly suffered under Denise's selective enforcement. The absurdity of banning someone for swimming too well had become a rallying point, showing the community that the HOA's authority could be challenged. Ryan decided the time had come to confront the board publicly. He scheduled a formal meeting, requesting to present his evidence and challenge the ban in front of multiple board members and any residents who wished to attend. The notice he sent was professional, respectful, and thorough. He outlined the reasons for his appeal, detailed his documented evidence, and highlighted the selective nature of enforcement. Yet even as he waited for a response, he knew the board would resist. Their history of intimidation suggested they would attempt to discredit, delay, or dismiss his claims entirely. The day of the meeting arrived. Ryan entered the HOA conference room with a folder of meticulously organized materials. Other residents quietly observed from the back of the room. There was a sense of anticipation, as if everyone understood that this confrontation would be more than a personal dispute. It was a test of power, fairness, and accountability. Denise appeared calm on the surface, but her eyes betrayed a mixture of irritation and wariness. Ryan recognized the look instantly. She was calculating, preparing her next move, unsure how to respond to a resident armed with facts, logic, and public awareness. He began by presenting his evidence systematically. Video clips demonstrated his calm swimming patterns, neighbor statements confirmed he was never disruptive, and records of prior complaints against other residents showed a clear pattern of selective enforcement. The room's atmosphere shifted. Board members exchanged uncomfortable glances, some whispering among themselves, realizing that Ryan's claim was supported by indisputable evidence. The absurdity of banning someone for excelling at swimming became undeniable. Residents who had been silent for years began nodding in agreement. A few voiced quiet support, noting that they too had experienced arbitrary fines or warnings for minor issues. The coalition Ryan had built emerged into view, their presence lending weight to his appeal. For the first time, the HOA's authority appeared vulnerable, their carefully maintained image cracking under scrutiny. Denise, for the first time, seemed uncertain. Her calculated dominance was being challenged in a way she had not anticipated. Denise attempted to assert control, citing vague rules and subjective interpretations of community comfort. However, Ryan calmly countered each point with concrete evidence. The inconsistencies in her claims became glaring. Her insistence that his swimming made residents uncomfortable was contradicted by the testimonies, footage, and even anecdotal observations from other attendees. The board's inability to provide a logical, consistent justification revealed the ban as what it truly was: a personal vendetta disguised as rule enforcement. The room's energy shifted further in Ryan's favor, as residents realized the absurdity and injustice of the situation. The conversation escalated when Ryan disclosed an internal email leak from one of the HOA volunteers, revealing Denise's personal motives. The email explicitly referenced her perception of Ryan as too competent and drawing unwanted attention, confirming that the ban was entirely personal. The impact of this revelation was immediate. Board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some avoiding eye contact. Residents murmured among themselves, realizing the extent of the board's manipulation. The veil of authority that had long protected Denise and her allies was beginning to lift. By the end of the meeting, the HOA was cornered. Their attempts to intimidate, dismiss, or fabricate reasons for the ban had failed. Ryan had presented clear, undeniable evidence that exposed both the absurdity of the swimming ban and the underlying favoritism within the board. Residents, once fearful of confrontation, now began asking pointed questions, challenging other arbitrary rules, and demanding transparency. The room's atmosphere had transformed from tense to electrified, charged with the realization that accountability was finally within reach. Outside the meeting room, whispers spread rapidly. Social media threads lit up with discussions of the case. Neighbors shared stories of other petty fines and rule enforcement, and the community began organizing quietly to demand reform. Ryan's efforts had triggered a chain reaction. The ban, initially intended to suppress and humiliate him, had instead revealed the HOA's vulnerability and emboldened the community. The narrative had shifted. What was meant as punishment became a catalyst for awareness, unity, and eventual resistance against arbitrary authority. As the day ended, Ryan felt a mixture of relief and anticipation. The first confrontation had revealed cracks in the HOA's control, but he knew the fight was far from over. Denise and her allies would not concede easily. They would attempt countermeasures, subtle intimidation, and continued obfuscation. Yet Ryan had something they could not counter: documented evidence, community support, and the moral high ground. The pool ban had evolved from a personal grievance into a larger battle for fairness, transparency, and the exposure of systemic favoritism. The confrontation had set the stage. Residents were now aware, engaged, and questioning authority. Ryan understood that the next steps would determine whether this momentum would lead to meaningful change or be stifled by further attempts at intimidation. The power struggle was only beginning, but the HOA's carefully maintained image had been irrevocably damaged. The absurdity of banning someone for swimming too well had become the spark that ignited a broader movement, one that Denise and her allies could no longer ignore. In the days following the public confrontation, Clearwater Ridge was buzzing with whispers, curiosity, and cautious excitement. Residents who had previously accepted the HOA's arbitrary rules were now openly discussing injustices they had long endured in silence. Ryan's persistence had created a ripple effect, emboldening neighbors to question authority and share personal experiences. What began as a swimming ban had transformed into a community-wide conversation about fairness, transparency, and accountability. The pool, once a simple recreational space, had become a symbol of resistance against arbitrary power. Ryan continued to expand his documentation. He created an organized archive with video evidence, neighbor testimonies, and records of previous HOA actions that illustrated systemic favoritism. Each piece reinforced the narrative that the swimming ban was not about rules or comfort but about personal vendettas and selective enforcement. The depth of his evidence began attracting attention beyond immediate neighbors. Local bloggers and community newsletters started sharing the story, highlighting the absurdity of banning someone for excelling at swimming. The HOA's credibility was eroding rapidly. With mounting evidence, Ryan convened informal meetings with residents. He encouraged them to document instances of arbitrary fines, invasive inspections, and favoritism. While many feared retaliation, they trusted Ryan's approach, methodical, respectful, and factual. Slowly, a coalition emerged. Families, retirees, and long-term residents united under a shared purpose. The growing collective realized that the HOA's control relied on fear, and transparency was their most effective countermeasure. Ryan had unknowingly become a leader, guiding his community toward empowerment and accountability. Denise and the board, meanwhile, were on edge. Their attempts to intimidate Ryan had failed spectacularly, and the rising community support threatened their authority. They circulated new, stricter notices for unrelated minor infractions, hoping to divert attention from the swimming ban. Yet, these moves only reinforced the perception of selective enforcement and petty control. Residents began questioning every decision, noticing inconsistencies, and comparing experiences. The HOA's veneer of fairness was cracking. Ryan's meticulous documentation became the foundation for a community-led push for transparency and reform. The movement reached a turning point when a petition was organized. Residents, inspired by Ryan's evidence and leadership, signed a formal request for the reversal of the swimming ban and the implementation of clear, objective rules for community enforcement. The petition emphasized fairness, accountability, and equal treatment for all residents. It was a powerful statement, a collective demand that arbitrary authority be replaced by transparent, equitable governance. Denise's attempts to maintain control appeared increasingly futile in the face of unified opposition. Ryan also leveraged social media and local press. Short video clips, images of the pool, and excerpts from testimonies were shared widely, highlighting the absurdity of banning someone for swimming skillfully. The story went viral within the local community and caught the attention of neighboring associations. The HOA's reputation suffered, as residents and outsiders alike began to question the board's decisions. Public exposure had become an effective tool. The very control the HOA had relied on was being undermined by transparency and unity. As support continued to grow, Ryan prepared for the next formal HOA meeting. He coordinated with coalition members, ensured all evidence was organized, and rehearsed a strategic presentation. The goal was not just to reverse the swimming ban but to demand structural changes that would prevent future abuses of power. Residents were ready to speak, challenge the board, and insist on accountability. Ryan understood that this moment could define the community's future, either entrenching arbitrary control or ushering in a new era of transparency and fairness. The day of the second formal meeting arrived. The room was packed with residents, their expressions a mix of anticipation and determination. Board members, including Denise, appeared visibly uneasy. Ryan presented the evidence, detailed the petition, and highlighted the growing public attention. Residents shared personal accounts, creating a chorus of voices demanding fairness. The cumulative impact of documentation, transparency, and collective courage was undeniable. The swimming ban was not just challenged. The HOA's authority itself was being scrutinized under the light of community accountability. By the end of the meeting, the swimming ban was officially overturned. The decision was announced in writing, acknowledging the excessive, arbitrary nature of the restriction. More importantly, the coalition had secured a commitment from the board to review internal policies, establish objective guidelines for enforcement, and provide clear avenues for appeals. While the battle against petty power had been won in this instance, Ryan and his allies understood that ongoing vigilance was necessary to ensure fairness continued. The triumph was not just personal but communal, a demonstration that transparency and unity could challenge entrenched authority. Ryan's story quickly became emblematic of resistance against arbitrary control. Neighbors who had long tolerated minor injustices now spoke out, questioned decisions, and demanded clarity. The pool, once a symbol of restriction and personal vendetta, had become a beacon of fairness and empowerment. Ryan reflected on the journey. What began as a seemingly ridiculous ban had evolved into a movement that exposed abuse, rallied the community, and transformed Clearwater Ridge. The experience reaffirmed that standing up for what is right, documenting truth, and fostering unity could turn even the most absurd injustice into a catalyst for meaningful change. The weeks after the formal meeting brought a new sense of balance to Clearwater Ridge. Ryan's victory in overturning the swimming ban had set a precedent. The community now understood that arbitrary decisions could be challenged, that evidence mattered, and that residents had the power to demand fairness. The pool, once a place of tension and absurd restrictions, returned to its original purpose, a space for recreation, relaxation, and community connection. Yet the significance went far beyond swimming. It was a triumph for transparency, accountability, and collective courage. Residents who had initially stayed silent now began advocating for systematic changes. Meetings were more transparent, minutes were shared promptly, and guidelines for enforcement were clearly outlined. The board, having felt the pressure of public scrutiny, made concessions to ensure policies were equitable and verifiable. Ryan, once targeted personally, had indirectly inspired a cultural shift in the neighborhood. The coalition he had quietly built continued to function as a watchdog, monitoring fairness in enforcement and ensuring no resident could again be victimized for arbitrary reasons. The absurdity of the original ban became a community anecdote, shared with humor and incredulity. Parents recounted the story to children, neighbors discussed it over barbecues, and social media posts celebrated the triumph of common sense over petty authority. Ryan's careful documentation of videos, testimonies, and internal HOA correspondence was referenced repeatedly, serving as both evidence and inspiration for other communities facing similar overreach. It became clear that the incident was no longer isolated. It was a lesson in civic empowerment, a case study in how collective action and transparency could hold governing bodies accountable. Despite the victory, Ryan remained vigilant. He knew the board's power had not vanished. It had only been tempered by community awareness and scrutiny. Ongoing participation in meetings, continued documentation, and encouraging neighbors to voice concerns became part of his routine. The effort was not about confrontation for its own sake, but about fostering a culture where fairness, accountability, and transparency were valued. The HOA's authority now operated within the boundaries of public oversight rather than unchecked discretion. Internally, Ryan reflected on the personal journey. What began as an arbitrary ban for swimming skillfully had grown into a broader mission of advocacy, evidence-based challenge, and community leadership. He had learned the importance of patience, strategic planning, and meticulous documentation. He realized that standing up to arbitrary authority was not just about correcting a personal grievance. It was about empowering others, building trust, and creating a framework where rules served the community instead of controlling it. The triumph was both personal and communal. By the end of the summer, the neighborhood had transformed. Residents were more engaged, questioning decisions, and supporting one another in ensuring fairness. The pool, sunlit and calm, became a symbol of restored balance and rationality. Ryan often watched from the edge, observing children and families enjoying the space freely. The joy of a shared community space, unburdened by petty restrictions, was a tangible reward. More importantly, the lesson of accountability, courage, and unity was firmly embedded in the culture of Clearwater Ridge. The story of the swimming ban remained a cautionary tale for the HOA. Attempts at future arbitrary enforcement were met with scrutiny, questions, and demands for evidence. Residents were no longer passive observers but active participants in shaping the governance of their neighborhood. Ryan's journey had turned a personal injustice into a catalyst for systemic change. The absurdity that once humiliated him had now strengthened the entire community, proving that vigilance, unity, and evidence could triumph over arbitrary authority. As the sun set over the pool, reflecting golden light across the water, Ryan felt a sense of fulfillment. He had faced ridicule, obstruction, and intimidation, yet persistence and integrity had prevailed. The HOA's attempt to assert control through an irrational ban had inadvertently exposed their flaws and galvanized a community. What had started as a personal grievance became a story of empowerment, courage, and change. Clearwater Ridge and the residents within it were forever transformed. The pool no longer represented restriction, but the triumph of fairness over absurdity.